Before the Dachshund became a familiar face on couches, in handbags, and in family photos, it was built for something far harsher. The name itself gives the secret away. In German, Dachshund means badger dog, and that is not a poetic nickname or a modern marketing label. It points straight back to the breed's original job in Germany, to go underground after badgers and other burrowing animals, where speed meant little and nerve meant everything. That detail matters because it changes the way the dog is seen. The short legs are not a quirk. The long body is not a decorative accident. Even the stubborn look in the eyes feels different once the old purpose is understood. This was a dog designed to disappear into dirt, roots, and narrow tunnels, to keep moving when the space around it tightened and the air turned sharp and stale. The modern Dachshund may look almost comical now, but that shape was once a working solution to a very real problem. The American Kennel Club traces that history directly to Germany, where the breed developed as a hunter of badgers and other underground quarry. That simple fact is often where the story stops. But it should not stop there, because the most interesting part begins the moment the obvious explanation starts to feel incomplete. If the Dachshund was made for a specific task, why does it seem to carry so many older instincts in its body? Why does its frame feel less like a sudden invention and more like the end point of something that had been building for a very long time? That is where the breed becomes stranger. A dog does not wake up one day with a body like this. It is shaped, piece by piece, by choices repeated across generations. Someone keeps the smaller, tougher worker. Someone favors the animal that holds focus in darkness. Someone values the one that can push forward where larger dogs fail. Over time, utility becomes form, and form begins to look inevitable. Yet, inevitability is often just history that has been compressed so tightly that people forget how many hands touched it. And so, the Dachshund begins to split in two inside the mind. On the surface, it is a beloved companion with a distinctive silhouette and an almost theatrical confidence. Underneath, it is a specialist, a survivor of selective pressure, carrying the memory of tunnels, pursuit, and confrontation with an animal that could fight back hard from below ground. That hidden past is what makes the breed so unsettlingly fascinating. It is not only cute, it is the descendant of a problem-solving machine. The real question, then, is not whether the Dachshund came from Germany. It did. The real question is whether that familiar origin story is complete, or whether it only describes the final chapter of a much older lineage. Because if ancient DNA has anything to tell us, it is that many dogs we think we understand are built on foundations far deeper than their official histories admit. For now, the simplest truth is still the strongest one. The Dachshund was born as a badger dog, a compact hunter made for pursuit below the surface. But that explanation only opens the door. It does not yet reveal how far back the body of this dog really reaches, or why its shape survived when so many others were lost. And once that door opens, the story of the Dachshund becomes much harder to keep inside the neat lines of breed history. By the early 1700s, the animal was already being described in a way that sounds almost like a warning. In books from that period, it appears as the Dachskrieger, the crawling badger, or the Dachskrieger, the badger warrior. Those names matter because they show more than a label. They reveal a mind that had already accepted this low, stubborn hunter as something distinct, something known for moving close to the earth and pressing forward with intent. Long before any modern show ring, long before polished breed standards, the shape and purpose were already joined in language. That is the first crack in the neat modern story. If a dog is already being named for how it moves, and for the kind of quarry it challenges, then its identity was not born overnight. It had been prepared by use, by reputation, and by repeated human choice. The written record does not yet give a full family tree, but it does give a dateline, and that dateline is older than many people expect. The early 18th century is not a vague mythic past. It is a documented moment, and once it appears, the familiar image of a recent German hunting dog starts to look incomplete. The most unsettling part is that these names suggest a character fully formed before the public ever tried to freeze it into a standard. A crawling badger, a badger warrior. One phrase emphasizes persistence below ground. The other emphasizes confrontation. Together, they sketch a creature built for a very specific task, but also for a very specific temperament. It was expected to push into darkness, keep going when the tunnel narrowed, and meet resistance without hesitation. That combination of body and attitude is not the kind of thing that appears by accident in a single generation. The record from the early 18th century, as summarized on the public Dachshund history page at Wikipedia, points to a dog that was already legible to people in utility terms. The names themselves became evidence of what the animal had become in daily life. And once that is understood, the question changes. It is no longer only how old the name is. It becomes how much older the behavior must be if a name like that could already feel natural enough to write down. That is where the trail becomes more interesting, because the written references are only the surface. A name can be recorded in 1 century while the body behind it has been shaped for far longer. The early 18th century documents tell us that by then, the concept was stable enough to be recognized. They do not tell us when the first short-legged hunter appeared, or how many generations of selection were needed before those words made sense. The history is visible, but only in fragments, and fragments can mislead. A people may write down a term only after the thing it names has already been moving through fields and burrows for years, perhaps centuries. The documents from the 1700s do not mark the beginning of the story. They mark the moment when the story had become too obvious to ignore. Somewhere behind those pages, there had to be dogs that could take the work seriously enough for the words to stick. That means the real chronology is deeper than the archive. So the next question arrives quietly, but forcefully. If the name was already settled in the early 18th century, what exactly had to exist before it? Not just a dog that looked different, but a set of traits repeated often enough to become recognizable, desirable, and worth preserving. The documents do not answer that alone. They only confirm that by then, Europe already knew this animal as something that crawled, chased, and fought below the surface. The rest of the story waits underneath that fact. The first clue is not the badger. It is the range. A dog built like this was never confined to one quarry, and that changes everything. On the public Dachshund entry at Wikipedia, the breed is described as having been used not only for badgers, but also for rabbits, foxes, wild boar, and even elk. That list matters because it strips away the comforting idea of a single-purpose hunter. This was not a narrow specialist shaped for one famous animal in one famous country. It was a body adapted for repeated clashes with very different kinds of resistance. Prey that hid underground, prey that ran fast, prey that fought back, and prey so large that courage alone could not be a decorative trait. It had to be useful. That is where the long shape becomes more severe in meaning. A low chest, short limbs, and a stretched spine were not simply the visual signature of a breed. They were the physical price of a hunting method that demanded leverage in tunnels, stamina in broken earth, and enough force to push forward when retreat would have been easier. In that sense, the Dachshund was never just a burrow hunter. It was a pressure-tested tool for environments where vision failed and instinct had to do the work. The body answered to terrain before it answered to fashion. And when the quarry widened from badgers to rabbits, foxes, wild boar, and elk, the image of the breed grows darker and more impressive at the same time. Rabbits suggest precision. Foxes suggest cunning, wild boar suggest danger, and elk suggest a level of audacity that borders on recklessness. No single animal explains all of that. Only a hunting tradition that valued persistence, nerve, and a refusal to break under threat can hold those examples together. The Dachshund's reputation begins to look less like an accident of appearance and more like the visible edge of a long selection process. That also forces a reinterpretation of the ancient DNA thread. If this form had already been favored over generations, then the genes preserved in older dogs were not merely carrying a cute silhouette into the modern era. They were protecting a package of working traits that had survived because they kept solving real problems in the field. The fossils and genetic fragments do not need to show a perfect modern Dachshund to prove the point. They only need to show continuity in the kind of body that could keep taking punishment and keep moving forward. The breed's modern elegance hides a history of impact. The human temptation is to look at the Dachshund and think of compact charm, little paws, and a comic length that fits neatly into domestic life. But the records attached to its hunting use complicate that softness. A dog that could be sent after badgers could also be asked to face animals that were faster, larger, or more dangerous, and that tells us the original selection pressure was not one dramatic scenario, but a whole landscape of hard encounters. The breed earned durability by being asked to do more than one impossible thing. That is why the next question matters so much. If the Dachshund's job was already so broad, then what exactly did breeders keep, and what did they let go as the breed moved from field to standard? Which parts of that old hunting machine survived into the companion dog people recognize today, and which parts were softened, narrowed, or hidden under later taste? The answer is not simple ornamentation. It sits in the tension between utility and identity, where a working dog slowly became a cultural emblem without ever fully surrendering the memory of the chase. And once that tension is visible, the breed can no longer be read as a novelty with long ears and a clever face. It becomes evidence that domestication often preserves force in quiet forms. A body designed to enter darkness, pursue stubborn quarry, and keep going under pressure can later live on cushions and still carry the echo of its original task. That echo is what makes the Dachshund so unsettling to understand. It looks playful at rest, but its frame remembers a harsher world. Stay with that contradiction, because it is where the next layer opens. The first clear surprise is physical. The early Dachshund did not look like the compact figure people picture today. According to Wikipedia's public history page on the breed, those older dogs were heavier, often weighing between 14 and 18 kilos, and their legs were longer than the ones seen in the modern standard. That changes the image at once. The low silhouette so familiar now was not the starting point. It was the result of a long narrowing of form. That detail matters because it breaks the illusion of a finished breed. A dog that began with more height under its chest and more mass through its frame was being reshaped toward a different balance, one that favored tighter movement through underground spaces. The later Dachshund did not simply appear as a clever little hunter. It was carved down from a broader working body. What survives in the present is only the end of that reduction, not the beginning. And the shape tells its own story. A longer-legged ancestor would have moved with more reach, more lift, and a different kind of stamina over rough ground. Then, step by step, selective breeding pulled the body lower and more compact. The change was not decorative. It was practical, patient, and deeply directed. The modern outline is therefore not a random quirk of appearance, but the visible trace of repeated decisions made by breeders who kept choosing for a specific job. That is where the historical picture becomes sharper and more unsettling. The Dachshund was not merely made smaller, it was refined toward a very precise kind of efficiency. Each shortening of the limb, each tightening of the torso, each increase in that stretched, ground-hugging profile helped define a dog better suited to follow scent and press into narrow places. The old form still carried the same intent, but the later form expressed it with greater intensity. In other words, the familiar Dachshund is not a simple descendant of an ancient type. It is the compressed version of one. This is why the old records and later breed histories do not describe a static line. They describe movement. They show a population in which size, proportion, and function were being adjusted over time until the body itself became a specialized tool. The breed's current look can feel inevitable because it is so recognizable, but the evidence points to a slower and more contingent path. The body was negotiated into its present shape. Even that is only part of the story. A shorter dog is not automatically a better hunter unless the rest of the body changes with it. The chest had to remain strong. The forequarters had to stay powerful. The backbone had to hold together under strain. So the transformation was not about making a toy-sized animal. It was about preserving strength while reducing height. That balance is the real engineering hidden inside the Dachshund's appearance. Seen this way, the modern breed becomes a record of pressure. Not pressure from one dramatic moment, but from generations of repetition. Breeders selected and reselected, each generation confirming the last, until the smaller shape seemed natural. Yet the older body never vanished completely. It survives in the breed's confidence, in its reach for scent, in the stubbornness people still recognize immediately. The form changed faster than the instinct did. That gap between body and memory opens the next question. If the Dachshund's shape was reduced so deliberately, what other parts of the old hunter were protected during that process, and which parts were allowed to fade? The answer lies in the next layer of evidence, where the breed's anatomy stops looking like a curiosity and starts looking like a compromise between power and restraint. If this kind of discovery pulls you deeper, stay with it, because the most revealing part is still ahead. By the time the Dachshund began to look familiar, its making was already a layered affair. In the public history recorded by Wikipedia's Dachshund entry, The breed was developed through crossings of European hunting dogs, including hounds and terriers from Germany, France, and England. That detail changes the whole picture. It means the Dachshund was not simply preserved from one ancient line, as if someone had found a finished animal in the past and carried it unchanged into the present. It was assembled. And assembly matters. A hound brings scent, persistence, and the discipline to follow a trail over distance. A terrier brings nerve, aggression toward a hidden target, and the refusal to back away when the ground closes in. Put those impulses together, then narrow the frame, and a new kind of hunter begins to appear. One built for pressure. One that can work in confined spaces without losing its drive. The long back and short limbs were only part of the answer. The deeper answer was behavioral. The breed had to think like a tracker and act like a fighter at the same time. That is why the Dachshund's origin feels so much less like a straight line and so much more like a calculated solution to a recurring problem. Different regions contributed different strengths. Germany supplied the hunting need and the direction of selection. France and England contributed bloodlines that helped sharpen the traits breeders wanted to keep. Over time, those choices fused into a dog whose appearance now seems unmistakable, even inevitable. But inevitability is an illusion created after the fact. In the beginning, every useful trait had to be held in place by human judgment. The most revealing part is that this process did not merely produce a shape, it produced a balance. If the animal became too heavy, it lost access to narrow ground. If it became too slight, it lost force and stamina. If the temperament dulled, the whole purpose collapsed. So breeders were not chasing beauty, they were managing contradictions. They wanted a dog that could scent, enter, push forward, and endure. The Dachshund became the visible record of that compromise. Seen from that angle, the breed's famous outline stops looking like a novelty and starts looking like evidence. Every inch of it suggests selection under constraint. Every trait hints at a decision that had to be repeated until it became stable enough to inherit. The dog we recognize today is the result of a long argument between function and form, carried across borders and generations. And once that becomes clear, a sharper question rises immediately. If the Dachshund was built from several European traditions, what did ancient DNA preserve that those later crossings could never fully erase? If this story is pulling you further in, stay with it, because the next layer is where the breed's past stops being guessed at and starts being read from the bones themselves. Then the explanation changed shape. For years, the Dachshund's short legs had been treated as a breeder's achievement, the result of patient selection pressing one useful form into another. But a 2009 study, reported by the National Human Genome Research Institute, exposed something older and stranger hiding underneath that familiar story. Researchers identified the genetic event behind the Dachshund's short legs and showed that a single mutation helps explain the trait not only in Dachshunds, but in several other dog breeds as well. The breed was not merely sculpted into this outline by human hands. It was also carrying a mutation that made this outline possible in the first place. That matters, because a mutation is not a style choice. It is a biological switch that changes what selection can do next. Once that switch appeared, breeders did not have to invent short legs from nothing. They could amplify what nature had already made available. The old picture of slow workmanship is still true, but it is no longer complete. The Dachshund's form was not assembled from intention alone. It was built on top of a hidden genetic event that had already altered the playing field. And that is where the story becomes much more unsettling. The dog that looked like a triumph of design was also an accident captured by design. A mutation appeared. Then people noticed its usefulness. Then generations of breeding turned usefulness into identity. In other words, the Dachshund's famous proportions were not just selected. They were inherited from a change so fundamental that it could reappear in other breeds with similar short-legged structure. The shared thread suggests that what seems unique in one dog may be part of a wider evolutionary pattern across canine history. The result is a deeper origin than the breed image suggests. Instead of one clean line from purpose to form, there is a layered sequence, a genetic alteration, a practical advantage, repeated human preference, and finally, a stable type that feels inevitable, only because the earlier steps have been forgotten. That is why the Dachshund keeps resisting simple explanations. Every time the story seems to settle into a hunting dog with a low silhouette, the evidence pushes it further back, toward the moment when a mutation quietly changed what a dog could become. Seen that way, the real revelation is not just that Dachshunds have short legs. It is that their signature shape is the visible trace of an event far smaller than the dog itself, yet powerful enough to echo across breeds and centuries. The breed carries a biological memory that predates its fame. Its outline is history in motion, preserved in muscle, bone, and inheritance. If that is what one mutation could do, then the next question is even harder. How many other traits we call breed character began as accidents before people learned how to keep them? The clue was hiding in the coat all along. Before the Dachshund became a symbol of a certain silhouette, its fur was already telling a quieter story, one built in layers. According to Wikipedia's Dachshund entry, the breed has 3 coat types: smooth, long, and wire. The smooth coat is the oldest, while the long and wire varieties came later through selective crosses. That detail changes the entire picture. It means the breed was not only being shaped in body and instinct, but also in texture, strand by strand, as breeders kept choosing which traits should remain and which should be pushed forward. That matters because fur is not decoration in a hunting dog. It affects how a dog moves through wet grass, cold earth, thorny brush, and the tight, dirty passages that once defined its work. A smooth coat would have been the first practical answer, easier to maintain and less likely to snag in the field. Later, when breeders wanted different performance traits or simply a more varied look, the long coat and the wire coat were brought out through deliberate crossing. The transformation was not abrupt. It was patient, selective, and deeply human. Even the surface of the Dachshund carries that evidence, so the breed's history is becoming harder to compress into a single origin story. First came the underground hunter, then the shorter body, then the mutation that helped lock in the legs, and now this, the realization that the coat itself was refined in stages. The Dachshund did not arrive as a finished design. It was assembled from choices, each one narrowing possibility and sharpening function. What looks inevitable today was once unstable, negotiated, and still unfinished. That is why the modern Dachshund feels so precise. Its shape, its movement, and even its coat type all point to repeated decisions made by people who were not trying to create a pet portrait. They were trying to solve a problem in the field. Yet every solution left a trace, and those traces accumulated until the breed began to look natural, as if it had always existed in this form. It had not. It was edited into being. And once the coat enters the story, another question appears. If breeders could refine the fur in this way, then what else in the Dachshund's identity was adjusted later than people assume? What part of the animal is truly ancient? And what part is only ancient-looking because selection became so good at hiding its own hand? The answer is visible in the contrast itself. The smooth coat remains the oldest layer, a reminder of the earliest practical form. The long and wire coats came afterward, not as accidents, but as choices repeated until they became familiar. That is the deeper pattern now, not a single invention, but a sequence of improvements so gradual that the final dog seems to have emerged whole. The Dachshund's history keeps revealing the same truth from different angles. Its body was refined, its coat was refined, and each refinement makes the next one easier to miss. Then the story shrinks again, and that change says everything. For centuries, the Dachshund had already been shaped for work underground, for pressure, for turning a narrow tunnel into an advantage. But in 19th century Germany, the prey changed. Rabbits multiplied, and the hunters who relied on these dogs needed a body that could follow a smaller quarry into tighter spaces. According to Country Life, that shift helped drive the development of the miniature Dachshund, a version designed for chasing smaller prey rather than the larger animals that had defined the breed's earlier reputation. That detail matters because it reveals something people often miss. The Dachshund was never frozen in a single historical moment. It kept being adjusted whenever the landscape of hunting changed. First came the long, low hunter built for badgers and other underground quarry. Then came a smaller form, tuned to rabbits in the 19th century, when the demands of rural life and game management were no longer the same. The breed did not merely inherit its shape. It was repeatedly asked to answer a new question, and each answer left the body a little different. The miniature Dachshund is therefore more than a compact variety. It is evidence that utility, not ornament, continued to guide the breed's evolution long after its ancient roots had formed. A dog that could once follow a larger animal into a burrow could, with selective pressure and careful breeding, be redirected toward a different scale of pursuit. The change in size was not a cosmetic preference. It was a practical response to a new hunting reality, one that turned the Dachshund into a living record of how human needs can reshape an animal without erasing what made it effective in the first place. And that is what makes this breed so unusual. Its history does not move in a straight line from old to new, from working dog to pet, from rough utility to polished appearance. It bends, it contracts, it adapts to the prey, then to the terrain, then to the expectations of the people who keep selecting it. The Dachshund that most people recognize today is the final visible layer of that process, but not the beginning of it. Its body still carries the memory of older tunnels, older hunts, and older decisions that were never made for beauty alone. By the time the miniature form emerged, the breed had already proven something larger than itself, that a dog can be redesigned again and again while keeping its core purpose intact. The same stubborn drive, the same close-to-the-ground build, the same determination to go where bigger dogs cannot go remained present, even as the target got smaller. In that sense, the rabbit boom in 19th century Germany did more than create a new variety. It exposed the Dachshund's deepest trait, which was never size, but adaptability under pressure. So the final answer is not simply that the Dachshund became smaller, it is that the breed kept listening to the world around it. When prey grew smaller, the dog followed. When the task changed, the body changed with it. And when modern eyes later turned the Dachshund into a symbol, a companion, a familiar shape on streets and couches, they were looking at the survivor of a long sequence of practical revisions. The miniature Dachshund did not interrupt that history. It completed another chapter in it. If this kind of hidden transformation changes how you see the Dachshund, stay with the next part of the story, because the last layer is where the breed becomes something